somewhere near the southern edge of Europe, perhaps on a limestone cliff above the Mediterranean Sea. One of the last communities of Neanderthals disappeared. Not in battle, not from a wound, not because another species hunted them to nothing. They disappeared the way a fire disappears when the last of the wood is gone. Quietly, without a final moment that anyone thought to mark. We do not know exactly when. We do not know exactly where. We do not know if any of them understood what was happening. If there was a last child born into a group too small to survive another winter. If there was a last elder who remembered when their people had been many. What we do know is that somewhere near the Rock of Gibraltar, in caves that still exist today, the evidence of their presence grows thin and then stops. The fires went cold. The tools were set down. The sounds they made, whatever language or call or song passed between them, fell silent for the last time. And the world continued without them. For 40,000 years. They waited in the dark of the earth, in layers of ash and bone and stone, for someone to come looking. This is what we found. This is what it means. And this is the story of a kind of mind that walked this planet for nearly 400,000 years, and then, in the span of a few cold centuries, was gone. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. The past is a long way down. But we are going there together. And there is no reason to rush. They waited this long. We can take our time. Chapter 1. Before we were alone. There is a version of human prehistory that most of us absorbed somewhere between childhood and adulthood without quite noticing we had absorbed it. In that version, our ancestors arrived in Europe and the Neanderthals were already doomed. Primitive, outmatched, destined to lose to a smarter, faster, more creative species that was always going to replace them. In that version, the story ends before it really begins, because the outcome was never in doubt. That version is wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in the details, while being right in the broad strokes. Wrong in the way that matters most. Which is wrong about what kind of beings the Neanderthals actually were, and wrong about what it actually cost the world when they were gone. Here is what the evidence shows instead. For a period that researchers estimate lasted somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 years, two kinds of human being shared the continent of Europe. Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, had been moving out of Africa in waves for tens of thousands of years before the period that most concerns us here. Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Western Asia for somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years before that. They were not newcomers to the landscape. They were the landscape, in a real sense. They knew its rhythms and its dangers and its resources in ways that had been accumulated and refined across hundreds of generations. When Homo sapiens began arriving in Europe in significant numbers, roughly between 50,000 and 45,000 years ago, they were not walking into empty territory. They were walking into a world that was already occupied, already understood, already shaped by another kind of mind. And for a long time, both kinds of mind were present in that world at the same time. The evidence for this coexistence comes from the archaeological record across dozens of sites in France, Spain, Portugal, Croatia, and the Iberian Peninsula. At some sites, layers of Neanderthal occupation and layers of early Homo sapiens occupation sit close enough together in the stratigraphy that researchers have spent decades debating whether the two groups ever actually met, or whether they simply moved through the same landscapes in different seasons, separated by time rather than space. At other sites, the evidence is less ambiguous. Research published in the journal Nature in 2021, led by a team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, used improved radiocarbon dating techniques to establish that Neanderthal populations in some parts of Europe persisted until at least 43,000 years ago, well into the period when Homo sapiens were already present on the continent. The overlap was real. It lasted, in some regions, for thousands of years. What happened during that overlap is one of the most debated questions in paleoanthropology. The old model assumed competition, displacement, possibly violence. Smarter species outcompetes slower species. Resources run out. The weaker group disappears. It is a clean narrative. It maps onto things we understand from the modern world. It feels like it should be true. But the physical evidence for large-scale violent conflict between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is remarkably thin. Researchers have documented individual cases of trauma on Neanderthal bones, as they have on the bones of early Homo sapiens. But nothing in the record looks like the aftermath of organized warfare or systematic extermination. What the record shows instead is something slower and stranger and, in its own way, more unsettling. It shows two populations existing in the same space, sometimes close enough to interact, and then gradually, over centuries and millennia, one of them becoming less present, not defeated, not destroyed, simply, incrementally, less. The Neanderthals did not lose a war. They lost a longer and quieter kind of contest, one in which the advantages were small and accumulated slowly. And the consequences only became visible across a timescale no individual could have witnessed. To understand what was lost when that contest ended, you have to first understand what Neanderthals actually were, not what the popular imagination made of them, not the stooped and brutish figures of early reconstructions, dragging their knuckles through a cave while more enlightened beings invented civilization just over the hill. What they actually were. According to the evidence that has accumulated over the past several decades, is something considerably more interesting than that, and considerably more difficult to dismiss. They were, by any reasonable definition of the word, people, not people like us, in every way. The differences were real, and they mattered in ways we are still working to understand. But people in the sense that counts most, beings who cared for one another, who thought about the world they lived in, who left traces of something that looks, from this distance, very much like an inner life. The story of what those traces tell us is where this account goes next. But before it does, sit for a minute with the image of that shared world. Two kinds of human being, moving through the forests and across the plains of Ice Age Europe, hunting the same animals, sheltering from the same storms, looking up at the same stars. For thousands of years, neither of them was alone. And then, slowly, one of them was. Chapter 2. Who they actually were. There is a reconstruction of a Neanderthal face in the Natural History Museum in London that stops people, not because it is frightening, because it is familiar. The eyes look back at you with an expression that is difficult to name precisely, something between recognition and distance. Like meeting someone you almost know, in a place you did not expect to find them. Researchers who worked on the reconstruction used ancient DNA evidence to determine skin tone, hair color, and eye color. What they produced was not a monster. It was a face. That face had a brain. And the brain was, in terms of raw volume, larger than yours. This is not a popular fact in the history of how Neanderthals have been portrayed, but it is a fact nonetheless. The average Neanderthal cranial capacity was somewhere between 1,200 and 1,700 cubic centimeters. The average for modern Homo sapiens falls in a similar range, with some studies suggesting Neanderthals were at the higher end. Brain size alone does not determine intelligence, and researchers are careful about drawing direct conclusions from it. But it does mean that the assumption of a vast cognitive gulf between Neanderthals and our ancestors is not supported by the most basic anatomical evidence we have. What the archaeological record supports instead is a picture of a species that was behaviorally complex in ways that took the scientific community a surprisingly long time to acknowledge. Begin with care. At a site called Shanidar Cave, in what is now northern Iraq, excavated beginning in the 1950s by the American archaeologist Ralph Selecki, researchers found the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals buried over a period spanning roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years. The burials themselves were significant. Deliberate burial of the dead is not a behavior associated with animals acting purely on instinct. It requires an awareness of death, a relationship to the body of the deceased that goes beyond the purely practical, and some form of communal agreement about how the dead should be treated. One of the Shanidar individuals, known in the literature as Shanidar I, tells a particularly striking story. This individual was a male who had survived to what would have been considered old age for a Neanderthal. Somewhere between 30 and 45 years. He had suffered, during his lifetime, a series of injuries that would have been severely debilitating. His right arm had been amputated or had withered to the point of uselessness. He had damage to his right eye socket consistent with a blow that may have left him partially blind. He showed evidence of healed fractures to his leg and foot. He survived all of this. In an Ice Age environment where the ability to hunt, to travel, and to contribute to the group's subsistence was essential. This individual lived for years with disabilities that would have made him a dependent rather than a contributor. He was fed. He was sheltered. He was kept alive by others who chose to keep him alive. That choice is not a small thing. It reflects a moral framework, an understanding of the value of an individual life that extends beyond their immediate usefulness to the group. The decision to care for someone who cannot fully care for themselves, to absorb the cost of that care because the alternative is unacceptable. The evidence suggests they had something like that framework. And when you hold that thought, something shifts in how you see them. Because what you are holding is not a theory about ancient creatures. You are holding the recognizable shape of something human. The impulse to not leave someone behind. The choice to feed a mouth that cannot feed itself. The refusal to let usefulness be the measure of a life. They had that. The bones of Shanidar I say so. Now move to symbol, because the story of who the Neanderthals were does not stop at kindness. On the southeastern coast of Spain, in a cave called Cueva de los Aviones, near the city of Cartagena, researchers found something that required a significant revision of the timeline of symbolic behavior in human prehistory. The cave contained perforated shells of the kind that would have been used as personal ornaments, along with pigments including yellow and red ochre, and a compound based on the mineral lepidocrasite, that appear to have been used as body paint or cosmetics. The dating of these materials, published in Science Advances in 2018 by a team led by João Zilhão of the University of Barcelona, placed their age at between 115,000 and 120,000 years before the present. 115,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had not yet arrived in Europe. The people who left those shells and those pigments in Cueva de los Aviones were Neanderthals. And what they were doing with shells and colored minerals was, by any reasonable interpretation, symbolic behavior. They were decorating themselves. They were using materials that had no nutritional value, no obvious survival function, to communicate something about who they were or how they wished to be seen. The shells in the cave point toward beings who understood that appearance carried meaning, who had, in some form, a sense of self that could be shown to others. Researchers continue to debate the precise interpretation of this evidence, and the careful language in the published literature reflects genuine uncertainty about exactly what these behaviors meant to the individuals who practiced them. But the evidence keeps pointing in the same direction. Further support comes from cave sites in Spain. In 2018, A study published in the journal Science by a team including researchers from the University of Southampton and the Max Planck Institute reported uranium-thorium dating of cave markings in 3 sites: at La Pasija, Ardalis, and Maltreviso. The dates came back at a minimum of 65,000 years before the present. Homo sapiens were not in Europe 65,000 years ago. The markings, which include geometric shapes and hand stencils, were made by Neanderthals. The interpretation of this finding remains genuinely contested in the scientific community. Some researchers question the dating methodology. Others argue that these behaviors do not necessarily require the same kind of symbolic cognition associated with the more elaborate figurative art produced by Homo sapiens tens of thousands of years later. These are legitimate debates. This account acknowledges them. What is not contested is that the evidence keeps accumulating in the same direction. Burial, care for the injured and elderly, personal ornamentation, pigment use, possible cave markings, a consistent pattern pointing toward a species that engaged with its world in ways that went beyond the purely practical. They were not us. That distinction matters and should not be collapsed for the sake of a more comfortable narrative. The differences between Neanderthal cognition and the cognition of Homo sapiens were real and likely significant in ways we are still working to understand. But the old assumption that the gap between them was vast and obvious and explains their disappearance simply does not hold up against what the caves and the bones and the shells have been telling us for the past several decades. They were people. Different people. But people. Chapter 3. The world they moved through. Close your eyes for a moment and try to place yourself in Europe 40,000 years ago. Not the Europe you know. Not the continent of cities and roads and managed forests and fields stretching to every horizon. The other Europe. The one underneath all of that. The one that existed for hundreds of thousands of years before the first stone wall was ever laid. Before the first seed was ever deliberately planted. Before any human hand shaped the land with the intention of making it something other than what it already was. Start with the cold. Not the cold of a winter morning when you pull a coat tighter and hurry inside. The cold of a world in which much of northern Europe lay under ice and permafrost for much of the year. In which the tree line sat hundreds of kilometers further south than it does today. In which the landscape between the glaciers and the Mediterranean coast was a vast open steppe that the wind moved across without interruption for thousands of miles. Ice Age Europe was not a single frozen wasteland. Researchers have documented periods of relative warming and cooling across the hundreds of thousands of years the Neanderthals inhabited the continent. But during the cold intervals, which were long and severe, the world they moved through demanded everything they had. The animals that shared that world with them were, in some cases, familiar, and in others, almost impossible to imagine from the vantage point of the present. Woolly mammoths moved across the open steppes, animals the size of modern African elephants, but covered in dense, reddish-brown fur, carrying tusks that could reach lengths of 4 meters. Cave lions, larger than any lion alive today, ranged across much of the continent. Woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears that could stand 2 meters at the shoulder, giant deer with antler spans of 3.5 meters, horses and reindeer and bison in numbers that are difficult to imagine against the backdrop of the depleted modern landscape. This was not a world on the edge of something. It was fully itself, complete, demanding, and the Neanderthals had learned to live in it across hundreds of thousands of years. Physically, their bodies were built for cold in ways that ours are not. Short limbs relative to their torso, conserving heat, wide nasal passages that warmed and humidified cold air before it reached the lungs, a robust and heavily muscled frame that generated significant body heat. Their proportions were not deficiencies. They were solutions. Answers written in bone and muscle to questions that the Ice Age kept asking. Season after season. Generation after generation. Their tools were solutions too. The Mousterian tool tradition. Named after a site in the Dordogne region of France, where characteristic stone tools were first identified in the 19th century, was not the crude technology of popular imagination. Mousterian tools were made using a technique called prepared core knapping. The toolmaker would carefully shape a stone core to a specific form before striking off flakes of a predetermined size and shape. This requires planning. Spatial reasoning. The ability to hold a mental image of the desired end product through multiple stages of preparation. It takes time to learn. It takes considerable practice to master. At sites across Europe and Western Asia, researchers have found evidence that Neanderthals carried stone materials, sometimes high-quality flint or other fine-grained stones, over distances of tens or even hundreds of kilometers. This implies planning beyond the immediate moment. The ability to think about future needs and carry resources in anticipation of them. Territories that were known, remembered, and passed on. They also used fire. Hearths are found at Neanderthal sites across Europe and Western Asia, and the evidence for controlled fire use goes back at least 400,000 years, in some lineages ancestral to Neanderthals. Fire meant warmth in caves during winters that could be brutal. It meant light in the deep dark of limestone caverns. It meant the ability to cook meat, increasing the caloric yield from a carcass. It meant protection from predators at night. And it meant something else. A focal point. A center that defined an inside and an outside. A shared warmth that was also, in ways we can only imagine, a social warmth. People gathered around a fire in a cave, in the dark, with the wind outside, and were together in a way that the open landscape did not allow. The caves themselves deserve attention, because they are the places where the Neanderthal record is most concentrated and most legible. The limestone geology of much of southern Europe produces cave systems that can be extraordinarily extensive, with chambers and passages that provided shelter from wind and rain and cold in ways that the open landscape could not. Neanderthals returned to these caves repeatedly, sometimes over thousands of years, layering their occupation one season or one generation on top of the last. In the caves of France and Spain and Gibraltar, the depth of Neanderthal occupation layers speaks to a relationship with specific places that went on for longer than most human civilizations have existed. These were not random stopping points on an aimless wandering. They were home, held in knowledge that accumulated slowly across many lifetimes, knowledge of which chambers stay warm in winter, knowledge of where water seeps through the rock in dry months, knowledge of the animals that shelter in the valley below in autumn and which pass through in spring, knowledge that was not written anywhere, and that lived only in the minds of the people who carried it, passed from those who knew to those who needed to learn, in the way that all knowledge passed in a world without writing. And then that world began to change. Not all at once, not in any way that a single individual living through it could have perceived as a transformation, but across the timescale that the archaeological record allows us to see, the change is visible. The Neanderthal presence in Europe contracts. The sites that show their occupation become fewer, more clustered toward the south and west, more concentrated in the sheltered areas where the combination of climate and resources could still support a small group through a difficult season. The world they had known for hundreds of thousands of years was becoming, slowly and without announcement, a world that was no longer entirely theirs. Chapter 4. The Arrival. There is a temptation, when telling the story of how Homo sapiens came to Europe, to reach for the language of invasion, waves of newcomers, displacement of the old by the new, the march of a more capable species across a continent that could not resist them. The evidence does not support that narrative. What the evidence supports instead is something considerably more gradual, more uneven, and more interesting. Homo sapiens did not arrive in Europe as a unified force with a shared purpose. They arrive the way any population moves into new territory. In small groups, following resources, responding to climate, pushing into areas that were accessible and pulling back from areas that were not. The process was not a campaign. It was a slow diffusion, playing out across thousands of years, in a landscape that was itself constantly changing. The earliest confirmed presence of Homo sapiens in Europe dates to roughly 45,000 years ago, based on evidence from sites including Bacho Kiro Cave in Bulgaria, research published in Nature in 2021, led by Jean-Jacques Hublin of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, used a combination of ancient DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating, and detailed stratigraphic study to place modern humans at the site at approximately 45,000 to 43,000 years before the present. At roughly the same time, Neanderthals were still present across much of Western Europe. Two populations, one continent, thousands of years of overlap. What happened when they encountered each other is a question that the archaeological record approaches from multiple angles, and the answers are more layered than either the conflict model or the peaceful coexistence model fully captures. Consider the chattel-Perronian industry, a tradition of tool manufacture found at sites in France and northern Spain, dating to roughly 45,000 to 40,000 years ago. Chattel-Perronian tools show characteristics that overlap with both the Mousterian tradition associated with Neanderthals and the Aurignacian tradition associated with early Homo sapiens in Europe. Some of the sites where these tools have been found also yielded personal ornaments, including perforated animal teeth and small rings made from mammoth ivory. Ancient DNA analysis has suggested that at least some chattel-Perronian sites were occupied by Neanderthals, though researchers continue to debate whether these represent clear evidence of cultural exchange or reflect more complex patterns of site use. The question has not been fully resolved. What the evidence does suggest is that the two populations were not simply occupying the same landscape in complete ignorance of each other. Some form of proximity, some form of observation, and possibly some form of exchange appears to have occurred, not the kind of interaction you would expect from two populations locked in existential conflict. Something quieter than that. Something harder to name. Now set that alongside what was happening to Neanderthal populations during this same period. Researchers studying the demographic history of Neanderthals using ancient DNA have found evidence that their populations were already small and fragmented before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe in significant numbers. Work by researchers including Svante Paabo of the Max Planck Institute, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for his foundational contributions to the study of ancient genomes, has shown that the genetic diversity of Neanderthal populations was low. This suggests they had gone through periods of significant population reduction, even before the period of contact with Homo sapiens. A population that is already small and fragmented is far more vulnerable to any additional pressure than a population at full size. Small populations are more susceptible to the effects of random chance on reproduction and survival. They are less able to recover from bad years, from disease, from the loss of key individuals who carried specific knowledge. They have less buffer against the kind of incremental disadvantages that, accumulated over generations, can tip a group from survival toward extinction. Think of it this way. Competition for resources does not require conflict. It does not require one group to attack another or drive them from their territory at spear point. It requires only that two groups rely on some of the same resources in the same landscape, and that one group is slightly more efficient at obtaining those resources, or slightly better able to adapt when those resources shift, or slightly better connected across a wide enough geographic range to buffer local failures with support from elsewhere. Slight advantages, accumulated across enough time, producing outcomes that no individual on either side could have foreseen. The Homo sapiens spreading through Europe during this period appear to have maintained long-distance exchange networks evidenced by the movement of shell ornaments and raw materials across hundreds of kilometers at their sites. These networks allowed information about resource availability to flow across a much wider geographic area than any single group's territory. When one region fails, knowledge of alternatives elsewhere becomes survival critical. Whether Neanderthal groups had equivalent networks is debated. Some evidence suggests they did, at a smaller scale. Whether the scale difference mattered in the crunch is a question the archaeological record poses without fully answering. What is not in doubt is the direction of what followed. Across the period, from roughly 45,000 to 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthal presence in Europe contracts. Not uniformly, not in a single event. The populations that had ranged across the continent for hundreds of thousands of years were, over a period of thousands of years, becoming fewer, more isolated, more confined to the western and southern margins of the territory they had once occupied in full. The center was already emptying before the edges went quiet. Something was ending, slowly, without ceremony, in the way that most endings actually happen. Not all at once, but one quiet loss at a time, until the losses are more than what remains. Chapter 5. What the DNA Remembers. In 2010, a paper was published in the journal Science that changed, in a fundamental way, how the story of Neanderthals and modern humans could be told. The paper, authored by a team led by Svante Paabo of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, presented the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. Assembled from DNA, extracted from bone fragments, from 3 Neanderthal individuals recovered from Vindija Cave in Croatia. The project had taken years of painstaking laboratory work to complete, requiring the development of new techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA that had degraded over tens of thousands of years into fragments so small and so contaminated that distinguishing genuine Neanderthal sequence from noise was, for a long time, considered by many researchers to be essentially impossible. Paabo and his team did it anyway. And what they found when they read the Neanderthal genome against the genome of modern humans produced a result that caused genuine surprise even among researchers who had spent their careers studying the relationship between the two species. People of non-African ancestry carry, on average, between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Let that settle for a moment. The people alive today whose ancestry traces back to populations that left Africa and spread through Europe, Asia, and eventually the rest of the world carry, embedded in their own genomes, fragments of the Neanderthal genome, not as a curiosity, not as a trace so small it can be dismissed, as a measurable, functional component of who they are at the most fundamental biological level. Some of their ancestry was absorbed into ours. They did not simply disappear, they merged, in part, into the lineage that continued. The offspring of unions between the two populations were incorporated into the Homo sapiens lineage, and the genetic contribution of those unions persisted. It is in billions of living people today. The leading hypothesis, supported by the pattern of Neanderthal ancestry in modern human populations, is that the primary episode of interbreeding occurred outside of Europe, most likely in the Middle East or Western Asia, before the ancestors of modern non-African populations spread into Europe and beyond. This would have happened somewhere between 60,000 and 50,000 years ago, during a period when Homo sapiens moving out of Africa would have encountered Neanderthal populations in the Levant or in the region between the Mediterranean and the Zagros Mountains. Additional episodes of genetic exchange may also have occurred during the period of coexistence in Europe itself, though the signal is harder to distinguish. The question remains active in the research literature. What is established with confidence is the result. Neanderthal DNA is in modern human populations, and some of it has not simply persisted passively. Research published in the American Journal of Human Genetics has identified Neanderthal-derived variants in genes of the innate immune system. Specifically, in a cluster of genes called the toll-like receptor genes, which play a fundamental role in the body's first-line response to bacterial and viral pathogens. These variants are present in non-African populations at frequencies higher than would be expected if they were simply neutral remnants of ancient interbreeding. The elevated frequencies suggest these variants were useful. The hypothesis is that Neanderthals, having lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, had evolved immune responses to the pathogens of those environments across a very long time. When Homo sapiens arrived in those same environments, the Neanderthal immune variants they had inherited through interbreeding may have helped them survive diseases their own evolutionary history had not prepared them for. The people who came after were helped, in part, by what the Neanderthals had learned. There is something in that which resists easy categorization. It is not quite tragic, because the benefit was real, and people are alive today, in part because of it. It is not quite redemptive, because the Neanderthals who provided those immune variants did not survive to benefit from the exchange themselves. It is something more complicated than either. It is the record of two populations in contact, exchanging something at the most intimate biological level, and one of them passing on a gift that it did not know it was giving to a future it would not be part of. Paabo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for his discoveries concerning the genomes of extinct hominins and human evolution. His work did not simply add a detail to the existing story of human origins. It revealed that the story we had been telling was incomplete in a way that matters. The story we had been telling went like this. Homo sapiens arrived. Neanderthals died. One chapter closed. Another opened. Clean. Sequential. Final. The story the DNA tells is different. The boundary between the two chapters was permeable. The ending of one kind of human being was not a simple termination, but a transformation. Partial and incomplete and messy, in the way that biological reality is always messy. But real. This does not make the loss smaller. A species can contribute to the survival of another, and still be gone. Still be absent from the world, in all the ways that matter for the experience of being a living thing in a specific time and place. The Neanderthal who sat by a fire in a cave in Gibraltar 40,000 years ago was not comforted by the knowledge that fragments of their genome would persist in the descendants of other people, in a world they would never know. The loss was real. The absence is real. But the DNA adds something to the story that changes its shape. It says that the ending was not clean. It says that something crossed the boundary between the two populations and survived. It says that the story of the last Neanderthals is not only a story of ending, it is also held carefully alongside the ending. A story of continuation. Chapter 6. The Long Retreat. A fire going out. Not doused suddenly. Not smothered. A fire that simply runs out of what it needs. Slowly. Over a long night. The flames becoming smaller and less frequent. The light contracting toward the center. The warmth fading so gradually that the person sitting beside it might not notice the exact moment it stopped giving heat and started only glowing. And then the moment the glow itself went dark. That is closer to what happened to the Neanderthals than any narrative of sudden collapse or dramatic last stand. The disappearance was a long dimming, measured not in battles but in generations. Not in defeats but in absences. One group that had been there was no longer there. Then another. Then another. Further west. Further south. Until only the edges remained. And then the edges too. Understanding how this happened requires sitting with some uncomfortable arithmetic. Population biology has a concept called the minimum viable population. The smallest number of individuals in a species or a group that can sustain itself over time without collapsing into extinction through the compounding effects of inbreeding. Random fluctuation in birth and death rates. And the accumulated bad luck that small groups cannot absorb the way large groups can. Below a certain threshold, a population becomes fragile in ways that are not immediately visible but are ultimately fatal. The Neanderthal populations of the late period appear from the genetic evidence to have been operating in exactly this zone of fragility. Research, using ancient DNA to reconstruct Neanderthal population history, including work published by researchers at the Max Planck Institute and collaborating institutions, has found signatures in the Neanderthal genome consistent with long periods of small population size, limited genetic exchange between groups, and the kind of inbreeding that occurs when a population is both small and isolated. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for this comes from a Neanderthal individual recovered from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. The genome of this individual, a female who lived roughly 50,000 years ago, showed that her parents were half-siblings. The group she came from was small enough and isolated enough that close relatives were mating with each other. Into that stressed system came additional pressures. Climate is the first, and perhaps the most significant. The period between roughly 45,000 and 40,000 years ago, precisely the period during which Neanderthal populations were contracting most rapidly, included episodes of severe climatic instability. Research using ice core records from Greenland has identified a series of rapid climate oscillations during this period. Events in which temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere shifted dramatically over timescales of decades to centuries. For a large, well-connected population, with robust exchange networks and diverse resource bases, such oscillations are stressful but manageable. For a small, isolated group, with limited ability to move or draw on support from elsewhere, a single severe winter that kills a significant fraction of the prey animals they depend on can be the event that tips the demographic balance past the point of recovery. There was no second chance. The second pressure was indirect competition with Homo sapiens populations that were, by this period, present across much of the continent. Two populations using overlapping resources in the same landscape will, over time, partition those resources in ways that favor the population with marginal advantages in efficiency, flexibility, or network connectivity. A slight reduction in the average caloric intake of Neanderthal groups. A slight increase in the distance they needed to travel to find adequate prey. A slight decrease in the frequency with which groups encountered each other and exchanged individuals. Maintaining genetic diversity and passing knowledge from one community to another. Small disadvantages, accumulating across generations, producing a slow and quiet demographic decline that no individual living through it could have perceived as the end of their kind. The third pressure is one that the research literature has only recently begun to address seriously. Disease. When populations that have been separated for long periods come into contact, the pathogen exchange that accompanies that contact can be devastating for the population with less prior exposure. Homo sapiens, arriving in Europe from populations that had spent tens of thousands of years in Africa and the Middle East, would have carried pathogens to which they had evolved some degree of resistance. Neanderthal populations, separated from the African lineage for hundreds of thousands of years, would have had no such prior exposure. We have no direct evidence of epidemic disease in the Neanderthal record. The preservation conditions for that kind of evidence are extremely poor. What the research literature offers is a hypothesis, supported by the general principles of population biology and the documented dynamics of contact between previously isolated populations. That disease may have played a role in the demographic decline. The archaeological record shows. The honest statement is this: we do not know how much disease contributed. We know it is a plausible contributing factor. We know the precedents from later human history suggest it should not be dismissed. Watch the map of Neanderthal occupation across Europe as you move through time. From 100,000 years ago to 70,000 to 50,000 to 40,000. What you see is a shape contracting from the edges inward. The northern and central parts of the continent empty first. The populations that remain become more clustered toward the south and west. The Iberian Peninsula becomes one of the last strongholds. And within the Iberian Peninsula, the populations pull further south, toward the coast, toward the warmer margins, toward the places where the sea moderates, the climate and the resources remain available a little longer than elsewhere. At the end of that contraction, at the very southwestern tip of Europe, there is a rock, a limestone massif rising from the water at the point where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, a place where the cliffs face south across open sea, where the caves cut deep into the rock and hold the warmth longer than the open landscape can, where the sea below offers resources that do not disappear when the land grows cold. The evidence suggests that Neanderthal groups were present in Gibraltar, at the site known as Gorham's Cave Complex, later than almost anywhere else in Europe. The dating of their occupation at this site is, as responsible accounts of the subject must acknowledge, a matter of ongoing research and genuine scientific debate. Different dating methods applied to the same materials have produced different results. The most commonly cited figures place the latest Neanderthal occupation at Gorham's Cave at somewhere between 28,000 and 40,000 years before the present, though many researchers now favor dates toward the older end of that range. And the question has not been fully settled. What is not in dispute is that Gorham's Cave Complex, designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2016, specifically because of its significance to the study of Neanderthal occupation, represents one of the latest and most richly documented Neanderthal presences in the archaeological record of Europe. The long retreat ended here, or near here, or somewhere in this general region, in a time and place that the evidence points toward without being able to fix with perfect precision. And what the people who sheltered in those caves were doing in the last generations of their kind is a story that the caves have been holding in their sediments for 40,000 years, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right questions to come and read it. Chapter 7. Gibraltar, the Last Refuge. Stand at the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula on a clear day and look south. You can see Africa. Not a suggestion of land. Not a smudge on the horizon that might be cloud or might be coast. On a clear day, the mountains of Morocco are visible across 14 kilometers of open water, close enough that the separation between the two continents feels almost accidental. As if the sea has made a mistake, it might at any moment correct. The Rock of Gibraltar rises from this narrow strait on the European side, a limestone massif approximately 426 meters at its highest point, its southern and eastern faces dropping in steep cliffs to the sea below. Its interior riddled with the cave systems that limestone geology produces over millions of years of water moving through soluble rock. It is one of the most dramatic pieces of real estate on the continent of Europe, a sentinel at the edge of two worlds, watching the Mediterranean to the east and the Atlantic to the west, positioned at the hinge point between a closed sea and an open ocean. For the Neanderthals who came here in the final period of their presence in Europe, it was something else. It was a place where survival was still possible when it had become impossible, or nearly impossible, almost everywhere else. The reasons for this are partly climatic and partly ecological. Gibraltar's position at the southern extreme of the Iberian Peninsula, flanked by open water on multiple sides, gives it a climate significantly milder than the interior of the continent. During the periods of maximum glacial cold that characterized the late Pleistocene, the region around Gibraltar would have experienced conditions less severe than those prevailing further north and inland. The sea moderates temperature extremes. The southward-facing cliffs trap solar warmth. The surrounding waters provide a resource base. Fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seabirds, that does not disappear in the way that terrestrial prey populations can disappear when the climate shifts. The caves of the Gorham's Cave Complex, which includes Gorham's Cave itself, along with Vanguard Cave, Hyena Cave, and Bennett's Cave, open onto the eastern face of the rock, facing the Mediterranean. They are accessible from a narrow beach at the base of the cliff. The sea level during the period of Neanderthal occupation was lower than it is today, by as much as 60 to 80 meters at some points, meaning that the caves would have looked out over a coastal plain that is now submerged, a landscape of resources and movement that we can no longer directly examine. Picture it for a moment, a shoreline that no longer exists, tidal flats stretching out toward a sea that was further away than it is now, rock pools accessible at low tide, the cliff above, with its dark cave mouths facing the morning light, and somewhere in those caves, a fire, small, consistent, tended. The research conducted at Gorham's Cave Complex over the past several decades, led principally by Clive Finlayson of the Gibraltar Museum and his colleagues, has produced a picture of Neanderthal occupation that is both detailed and, in some of its implications, remarkable. The cave floors contain layer upon layer of occupation debris. The accumulated residue of fires and meals and tool manufacture, and the ordinary business of daily life, across a period researchers estimate, spans tens of thousands of years. Reading those layers is slow and careful work, requiring the kind of methodological precision that distinguishes professional archaeology from simple excavation. Each layer must be dated, its contents catalogued, its relationship to the layers above and below understood before any conclusions about the behavior of the people who created it can be drawn. What those layers have revealed is a community of Neanderthals who were behaviorally sophisticated users of a complex coastal environment. The faunal remains in the cave deposits include not only the large terrestrial mammals, horses, ibex, red deer, that are typical of Neanderthal hunting across their range, but also the bones of marine and coastal species in proportions that were, when first reported, surprising to many researchers. Bluefin tuna, dolphins and porpoises, monk seals, marine birds, including gannets and cormorants and razorbills, shellfish of multiple species collected from the rocky shore below the caves. The presence of bluefin tuna attracted significant attention when it was reported by Finlayson and colleagues in a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2011. Bluefin tuna are not a species that wash up on beaches in convenient numbers. They are large, powerful, fast-moving fish. The presence of their bones in Neanderthal occupation layers implies either that the Neanderthals of Gibraltar were engaged in some form of active fishing, or that they were exploiting tuna in shallow water during seasonal inshore migrations. Either interpretation requires a level of engagement with the marine environment that the older picture of Neanderthals as purely terrestrial hunters did not anticipate. Researchers continue to debate the precise method by which the tuna were obtained. What is agreed upon is that the marine fauna in the cave deposits reflects a sustained use of coastal resources consistent with considerable knowledge of the local environment and its seasonal patterns. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar knew this coastline. They knew what it offered and when it offered it, and how to take advantage of what it provided. That knowledge was not improvised. It was accumulated, refined, and passed on across generations of people who called this specific place home. The bird remains in the cave. Deposits tell a related story. Analysis published by Finlayson and colleagues in multiple papers over the past 15 years has found that certain species appear in the record in patterns suggesting their feathers were being deliberately removed. Raptors and corvids, birds with large and visually striking plumage, show cut marks on their wing bones in locations that correspond precisely to the points where the large primary feathers attach. These are not the cut marks of someone butchering a bird for food. They are the cut marks that result from careful removal of specific feathers. The large, dark, visually conspicuous feathers that would have been the most useful for decoration or adornment. Researchers present this interpretation carefully, noting that the pattern is consistent with decorative use of feathers while acknowledging that alternative explanations cannot be entirely ruled out. What can be said is that the pattern is consistent, documented across multiple sites and multiple decades of research, and fits within a broader picture of Neanderthal symbolic behavior that the evidence has been building for years. And then there is the engraving. In 2012, a team led by Finlayson reported the discovery of a geometric engraving on the bedrock floor of Gorham's Cave. A pattern of cross-hatched lines cut deliberately into the limestone surface. The engraving was found beneath a layer of Mousterian occupation debris that was undisturbed, establishing that it predated the deposit above it and was therefore the work of Neanderthals rather than any later occupants. Dating of the overlying deposit suggested the engraving was at least 39,000 years old. The paper reporting this discovery, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, was careful about the interpretation it offered. The researchers described it as an abstract geometric motif and argued that its deliberate and systematic manufacture implied that the Neanderthals who made it were capable of producing a design that had meaning beyond the purely functional. Some researchers have questioned whether the lines could have been produced by repeated tool sharpening rather than deliberate artistic intention. Finlayson and colleagues addressed these objections in subsequent publications, noting that the regularity and geometry of the lines was inconsistent with accidental production. The debate has not been entirely resolved. That is worth saying clearly, because honest engagement with this evidence requires acknowledging where certainty ends and interpretation begins. What can be said is that the engraving exists, that it is old enough to be the work of Neanderthals, and that its deliberate character is supported by careful analysis. In a cave above the Mediterranean, at the far edge of the continent, one of the last communities of Neanderthals cut lines into the stone floor. We do not know what those lines meant. We do not know if the meaning was private or shared, understood by others in the group or known only to the maker. We do not know if the maker stood back and looked at what they had made and felt something that we would recognize as satisfaction, or the particular quiet of having expressed something that had previously existed only as an impulse. We know the lines are there. We know the hands that made them are not. And in the space between those two facts, between the mark that survived and the maker who did not, the entire weight of this story rests. Chapter 8. What they left in the cave. The cave does not announce what it holds. You would have to walk down to the narrow beach at the base of the eastern cliff and look up to see it, a dark opening in the limestone face, unremarkable from a distance. The kind of shelter that a person seeking refuge from wind and rain might notice and move toward without any particular sense of entering somewhere significant. Inside, the floor slopes gently downward. The chambers open and close as the rock permits. The light from the entrance fades quickly into a darkness that is total, and very old, and very patient. And in the sediments underfoot, layered in that darkness, lies the record of a community going about its life for tens of thousands of years. Begin with the birds. The bird bone assemblage from the cave deposits is extraordinary in its diversity. Researchers working with material from Gorham's Cave and the adjacent Vanguard Cave have identified the remains of more than 150 species of birds in the Neanderthal occupation layers. Many of these species are what you would expect in a coastal cave environment. Seabirds, wading birds, waterfowl, species that would have been available along the shoreline and on the rocky slopes of the rock itself. But a subset of the bird remains tells a different story. Raptors appear in the deposits in proportions that separate them from birds that were simply eaten. Golden eagles, bearded vultures, griffon vultures, white-tailed eagles. These are large birds with spectacular plumage. Birds whose feathers, particularly the long, dark primary feathers of the wings and tail, are visually dramatic in a way that smaller species are not. The cut marks on the wing bones of these raptors are located precisely at the points where the primary feathers attach. Researchers who have analyzed these marks, including work published in PLOS One and quaternary science reviews, have noted that their location and character is inconsistent with the processing you would apply to a bird you were preparing for food. When you butcher a bird for eating, you cut at the joints. You remove the meat-bearing portions. You work efficiently toward the goal of extracting nutrition. You do not spend time carefully cutting at the precise attachment points of the largest feathers unless the feathers are what you are after. The inference that the Neanderthals of Gibraltar were deliberately collecting the large feathers of raptors for use as personal decoration or symbolic ornamentation is supported not only by the evidence from Gibraltar, but by similar findings from Neanderthal sites across a much wider geographic range. Sites in Italy, France, Croatia, and the Iberian Peninsula have all produced bird bone assemblages with comparable patterns. The behavior was not a local quirk. It was consistent. It was widespread. It persisted across a substantial period of time. What does it mean to collect eagle feathers? In the context of human behavior more broadly, the collection of visually striking natural materials for personal adornment is almost universally associated with systems of meaning. Feathers mark identity, status, group membership, relationship to the world beyond the ordinary. They are worn because they communicate something to others, because the person wearing them wants to be seen in a particular way. We cannot know what eagle feathers meant to a Neanderthal in Gibraltar 40,000 years ago. The symbolic systems of a vanished people are not recoverable from the bones they left in a cave. Researchers present this evidence carefully, noting that the pattern is consistent with decorative behavior, while acknowledging that interpretation requires humility about what we can and cannot know. What can be said is that the behavior points toward beings who understood that appearance carried meaning, who used the materials of their world to express something about themselves that went beyond the purely functional demands of survival. Now move from the birds to the sea. The cave deposits contain large quantities of marine mollusks, mussels, limpets, clams, and other shellfish species collected from the rocky shore below the caves. Analysis of the shellfish remains from different stratigraphic layers. Work conducted by Finlayson and colleagues and published in quaternary science reviews has found evidence of systematic, sustained shellfish harvesting over extended periods. The species composition, the size of individuals collected, and the seasonal patterns reflected in shell growth rings all indicate a community that understood the rhythms of the marine environment well enough to exploit it efficiently across multiple seasons and multiple years. This is not the behavior of people stumbling onto the beach and grabbing whatever they find. It is the behavior of people who know the tide pools, who know which species are available in which season, who know the difference between a productive stretch of coastline and an exhausted one. People with detailed local knowledge, accumulated over time, applied with intention. And then there is the engraving, already described but worth returning to, here in the context of everything else the cave has yielded. The cross-hatched geometric pattern cut into the bedrock floor of Gorham's cave is, in one sense, a single mark from a single moment in the long occupation of this site. But considered alongside the feather collection, the systematic marine resource exploitation, the pigment evidence from related sites, and the personal ornamentation evidence from sites across the Neanderthal range, it becomes part of a coherent picture, a community that engaged with its world symbolically as well as practically, that used materials and marks to express something that the purely practical demands of daily life did not require. Researchers present this picture with appropriate care, noting that each piece of evidence carries its own uncertainties and that the collective interpretation, while compelling, remains subject to ongoing scholarly discussion. What can be said is this: A community of Neanderthals, living in caves above the Mediterranean at the far edge of the continent, in what may have been among the last generations of their kind, was still collecting eagle feathers, still systematically harvesting the resources of the sea with the knowledge of people who had learned this coastline across many lifetimes, still cutting marks into the stone of the place they called home. They were not simply surviving, they were living, in all the ways that living implies. Right up to the end. The cave record does not preserve a final moment. There is no layer that says, here is where it stopped. There is simply a point at which the Neanderthal signatures in the stratigraphy cease, above which the record changes or goes silent, below which the evidence of their presence is clear and consistent and rich with the details of a community going about its life. They did not leave behind the ashes of a last stand or the bones of a final battle. They left behind feathers and fish bones and shellfish shells, and a pattern of lines cut into the floor of a cave. And then they left nothing at all. The silence that follows their last traces in the record is the same silence that follows any life at its end. Not dramatic, not announced, simply the absence, where before there was presence, of everything that made them what they were. Chapter 9. The Arithmetic of Extinction. Why? Not, why did they disappear in the broadest sense? The broad outlines of an answer to that question have been assembled from the evidence already covered. Small populations, climatic stress, indirect competition, possible disease, the slow arithmetic of demographic decline playing out across thousands of years. The deeper question is more specific and more uncomfortable. Given everything they were, given the behavioral complexity, the cognitive capacity, the deep knowledge of their environments, the care for one another, the symbolic life that the feathers and the pigments and the engravings attest to. Given all of that, why was none of it enough? The answer does not resolve into a single cause or a clear villain or a decisive moment. It resolves into a set of compounding factors, each insufficient on its own, but together constituting a system that moved in one direction and did not stop. Population biology offers a way to understand the first layer of this. When a population falls below a certain size, the fitness of its individuals begins to decline in ways that are not immediately visible but are ultimately fatal. Larger groups have advantages that smaller groups do not. They find mates more easily. They cooperate in ways that increase hunting success. They maintain the social structures through which knowledge is transmitted from older to younger individuals. They absorb the loss of key members without losing the specific skills those members carried. Below a certain threshold, these advantages erode. Finding a mate requires longer searches, sometimes settling for closer relatives than would be optimal. The loss of a single experienced elder who knows the location of a seasonal water source is no longer a recoverable event. It is a genuine subtraction from the group's collective knowledge, a subtraction that cannot be replaced. The Neanderthal populations of the late period were, the genetic evidence suggests, already operating in this zone. Groups that were already small became smaller. The genetic consequences accumulated. The cultural consequences, the erosion of transmitted knowledge through the loss of key individuals, are not directly recoverable from the archaeological record. But the logic of small group dynamics makes them a plausible and significant factor. Now add climate. The period between roughly 43,000 and 40,000 years ago included several episodes of rapid and severe climatic deterioration. Cold events that are visible in the Greenland ice core record as sharp downward spikes in temperature proxies. A study published in the journal Science in 2020 by a team including researchers from the Max Planck Institute and several European universities used a combination of climate modeling, radiocarbon dating, and analysis of the distribution of archaeological sites to argue that the final disappearance of Neanderthals from most of Europe coincided with a period of severe climatic deterioration that would have dramatically reduced the carrying capacity of the landscape. Researchers note that this interpretation remains subject to ongoing debate, and that the precise relationship between climate events and Neanderthal population decline continues to be examined. In a landscape that can support fewer individuals overall, a population that is already small and fragmented has fewer places to go. There was no reserve to draw on, no larger network to call upon, no margin. The Homo sapiens factor, as it must be called when the evidence is handled honestly, is the most difficult element of this picture to characterize without either overstating or understating its role. The evidence does not support the narrative of active, organized violence as the primary driver of Neanderthal extinction. The skeletal record does not show the kind of mass trauma that would accompany systematic killing. What the evidence does support is the less dramatic but equally consequential reality of competitive exclusion operating through indirect means over a long timescale. Two populations using overlapping resources, one with slightly larger networks, slightly more flexible subsistence strategies, slightly better ability to buffer local failures with information and resources from elsewhere. The advantages do not need to be large. They need only to be consistent. Research modeling the likely demographic consequences of even small competitive advantages for Homo sapiens groups has found that advantages in the range of 1 to 2% in reproductive success or resource acquisition efficiency would be sufficient, if sustained over thousands of years, to produce the population dynamics that the archaeological record shows. These are not the advantages of a dramatically superior species overwhelming a helpless inferior one. They are the advantages of a slightly more adaptable system operating in an environment that was simultaneously becoming more challenging. Now consider what was lost in that going. Not in the abstract. Specifically, each Neanderthal group that fell below the threshold of viability carried with it a body of knowledge accumulated across that group's entire history in its specific landscape. Knowledge of where water could be found in a dry year. Knowledge of which plants had medicinal properties. Knowledge of the movement patterns of specific herds in specific valleys at specific seasons. Knowledge of the caves that provided protection from specific wind directions. None of this knowledge was written down. All of it existed in the minds of the people who carried it, transmitted from older to younger through observation and instruction and shared experience. When the people died, the knowledge died with them. There was no archive. There was no redundant copy stored elsewhere. There was only the minds of the living. And when those minds were gone, what they contained was gone. Absolutely. Multiply that loss across every Neanderthal group that disappeared over the course of thousands of years. Multiply it across the hundreds of generations and the dozens of distinct regional populations that had accumulated their own specific bodies of knowledge about their own specific environments. The extinction of the Neanderthals was not only a demographic event, it was an epistemological catastrophe, a destruction of knowledge on a scale and of a completeness that has very few parallels in the history of living things on this planet. A population that once spanned a continent, that had maintained itself across hundreds of thousands of years, that had developed complex behaviors and rich local knowledge, and what appears to have been a genuine interior life, reduced to zero. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, simply to zero. In the way that populations always reach zero, through the compounding of small deficits across enough time, until one generation produces fewer offspring than are needed to replace it. And the generation after that is smaller. And the generation after that smaller still. Until there is a last generation. And, in that last generation, one who is last of all. Chapter 10. The one we cannot name. There was a last one. This is not a poetic construction. It is a mathematical certainty. In any population that declines to extinction, there is by definition an individual who is the last, a being who draws a final breath and does not pass the threshold of existence on to another. a point at which the chain of biological continuity that had extended, unbroken, across hundreds of thousands of years, reaches its end. We do not know who that individual was. We need to say that clearly. And say it first, before anything else. The temptation to fill the unknown with a specific image, a solitary figure on a cliff at sunset, the last ember of a dying fire, is a temptation that feels like empathy but functions like invention. The evidence does not give us a specific individual. It does not give us a specific moment. It does not give us a location with the precision that a story about a last person would require to be told honestly. What the evidence gives us is a set of constraints within which that last individual existed, a geographic region, a broad time frame, a set of conditions that defined what their life would have looked like. The geographic constraint is the most solid. The evidence from Gorham's cave complex and from the broader pattern of late Neanderthal occupation in southern Iberia points consistently toward the southwestern margin of Europe as the region where Neanderthal presence persisted longest. This does not mean the last Neanderthal was necessarily at Gibraltar. Other sites in southern Spain and Portugal have also yielded evidence of relatively late occupation. And the dating of all these sites carries the uncertainties that attend methods applied to materials tens of thousands of years old. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the last communities of Neanderthals were somewhere in this region. Within those constraints, consider what life in the final communities would likely have looked like. Small. The groups that persisted into the final period would have been small. As the genetic evidence and demographic modeling both suggest, not a village, something closer to an extended family. A few adults, perhaps some children, perhaps some elders whose accumulated knowledge was the group's most precious resource, and whose deaths represented losses from which recovery became harder with each passing generation. They would have known the landscape around them with the intimacy that comes from a lifetime of dependence on a specific place. The caves where shelter was reliable. The stretches of coastline where shellfish could be harvested in the right season. The locations where fresh water could be found in a dry year. The movements of the animals they hunted and the birds they watched from the cliff tops. This knowledge was not abstract. It was practical, daily, survival, critical, and it was held in the minds of the people who had learned it across years of living in this specific place. They would have had language of some kind. The evidence for Neanderthal language is indirect, and the precise nature of their communicative capacity is genuinely debated among researchers. The FOXP2 gene, associated in modern humans with the fine motor control required for speech, has been recovered from Neanderthal DNA and found to be similar to the modern human version. The social behaviors documented in the archaeological record, the cooperative hunting, the care for injured and elderly group members, the transmission of technical skills across generations, all imply a level of communicative sophistication that would be difficult to achieve without some form of language. What that language sounded like is gone. What words it used for the sea and the rock and the eagle. What stories it carried about where the group had come from and what they believed about the world they lived in. These things have been absorbed into 40,000 years of silence and will not come back. They would have had relationships. This is perhaps the most important thing to say, and the most easily overlooked, because it is the most human and the least exotic. The individuals who made up the last Neanderthal communities were not symbols or representatives of a species. They were people who knew each other, who had histories with each other, who cared about each other in the specific and partial and complicated ways that social beings care about the particular individuals they share their lives with. There were, in all likelihood, bonds between parents and children, between siblings, between individuals who had hunted together and sheltered together and grieved together across years of shared experience. There were individuals whose loss was felt by those who remained, whose absence left a specific shape in the life of the group that no one else could fill. All of that specificity is lost. Every particular relationship, every individual quality, every private history that made up the interior life of the last Neanderthal communities is as inaccessible to us as the language they spoke. Now consider what it means to be the last. Not the last community, the last individual. At some point, the communities themselves would have fallen below the threshold of viability. Groups that had already been small would have lost members to age and illness and accident, and would not have been able to replace those members fast enough to maintain their numbers. The connections between groups, the occasional encounters that had previously allowed for mate exchange, and the sharing of knowledge and resources would have become less frequent as the total number of people decreased and the distances between them increased. At some point, a group becomes too small to function as a group. At some point, the individuals who remain are alone in a way that is qualitatively different from the solitude of a person who belongs to a larger community but happens to be alone at a particular moment. They are alone in the sense that there is no larger community to return to. We do not know if the last Neanderthal was aware of being the last. The concept of being the final member of a kind requires a form of abstract self-awareness that we cannot confidently attribute to any individual on the basis of the available evidence. What we can say is that the social losses that preceded the final ending would have been experienced as losses by the individuals who survived them. The death of a companion, of a parent, of a child, does not require an abstract understanding of extinction to be felt as grief. Grief is the response of a social being to the rupture of a social bond. And the evidence from Shanidar Cave and other sites of Neanderthal burial suggests that Neanderthals experienced and acknowledged that rupture in ways that involved deliberate ceremony and care. The last Neanderthals would have grieved. They would have lost people they knew and cared for. And they would have felt those losses as absences that reshaped the world around them. And the world around them was, by then, a world from which their kind was almost entirely absent. We know only what the record shows. And the record shows that they continued. That in the caves above the Mediterranean, in the final period of their presence on this planet, they continued to collect feathers and harvest shellfish and cut marks into the stone and do all the things that the evidence of their presence documents. They continued to live, fully and specifically, in the world they had, until they did not. Until there was a morning that one of them did not wake, and the number of Neanderthals in the world decreased by one. And then another morning, and another decrease, and then a morning on which the number reached 0, and the world became, for the first time in nearly 400,000 years, a world that contained no Neanderthals at all. No monument marks that morning. No record preserves it. The limestone of the rock, which has been accumulating its layers for millions of years and will accumulate them for millions more, registers the absence of Neanderthal occupation in the same way it registers everything else that has ceased to be part of its record. Silently, without comment, by simply containing no further evidence of their presence. The name we cannot give to the last Neanderthal is not just a name. It is the name of a way of being in the world that no longer exists. A specific set of perceptions. A specific relationship to the landscape of the southern Mediterranean coast. A specific body of knowledge and feeling and response that had been shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of existence in this world. We acknowledge it now, 40,000 years late, with the imperfect tools of a species that was not there and cannot fully imagine what was lost, but we acknowledge it, because the fact that we try, the fact that we dig in the sediments of caves and read the cut marks on bird bones and sequence the degraded fragments of ancient DNA in order to recover even a partial picture of who these people were and how they lived, says something about what kind of species we are. We are the species that was there when they ended. We carry fragments of what they were, and we have not, entirely, been willing to let them go. Chapter 11. What we carry. If your ancestry is from outside of Africa, Somewhere between 1 and 4% of your genome consists of DNA sequences shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal evolution. Not metaphorically, not in some loose cultural sense. In your actual cells, in the molecular instructions that your body reads every day to carry out the thousands of biochemical processes that constitute being alive, there are sequences in you that were present in Neanderthal individuals who lived in Ice Age Europe tens of thousands of years ago. This is among the most remarkable findings in the history of the study of human origins. Some of their ancestry was absorbed into ours. The genetic contribution of those unions persisted across tens of thousands of years of human history. It is in billions of living people today. And it has not simply persisted passively. Some of those inherited sequences appear to have been retained because they were useful, because they helped the people who carried them survive in environments that Neanderthals had known for far longer than Homo sapiens had. The people who came after were helped, in part, by what the Neanderthals had learned. Think about what that means in terms of time. The Neanderthal individuals whose DNA contributed to the modern human lineage lived somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 years ago, before agriculture, before cities, before writing, before any of the technologies we associate with the development of civilization, in the deep prehistory of our species, at a time when the world was almost unimaginably different from the one we inhabit. Two kinds of human being encountered each other and exchanged something that persisted. 40,000 years is longer than the entire span of recorded human history. And yet the molecular record of what happened between them is still legible, still recoverable by the right instruments, still capable of telling us something about who we are and where we came from. The Neanderthal sequences in your genome do not announce themselves. They do not produce a sensation or a memory or a dream that can be identified as Neanderthal in origin. They are simply there, doing the molecular work that DNA does, read by the cellular machinery of your body without distinction from the sequences that came from more recent ancestry. You cannot feel them, but they are working. In the cells of your immune system, in the proteins that your body produces in response to infection, in the regulatory sequences that control when and how certain genes are expressed. The contribution of a population that lived and died in Ice Age Europe is still present and still active. They did not leave monuments. They did not leave writing. They did not leave the kind of durable cultural record that allows us to know what they believed or what they valued or what stories they told about themselves. What they left is smaller than any of those things, and more durable than all of them combined. They left it in us, in the molecular architecture of the bodies of billions of people who have never heard their name and will never know the caves they sheltered in, or the coastlines they walked, or the fires they kept burning through the long winters of the Floor, Ice Age. And there is something in that which resists easy categorization. It is not quite tragic, because the exchange was real, and the benefit was real, and people are alive today in part because of it. It is not quite redemptive, because the Neanderthals who contributed to that exchange did not survive to benefit from it themselves. It is something more complicated than either. It is the record of two populations passing something across a boundary that one of them would not cross. One of them giving a gift that it did not know it was giving, to a future it would not be part of. They are gone, as has been said, and as must be said honestly, and they are not entirely gone, as must also be said. Both of those things are true, and the place where they are most true simultaneously, the place where the ending and the continuation exist together in a form that can be measured and confirmed, is inside you. If you stop for a moment, in the quiet before sleep, and consider that some small fraction of what you are was shaped by people who stood on limestone cliffs above the Mediterranean 40,000 years ago and watched the sea and felt whatever they felt in the face of a world that was slowly, without announcement, becoming one from which they were disappearing. Some fraction of what you are was there, not in any way you can access consciously, not in any way that resolves into an image or a sensation or a recognizable piece of knowledge, but in the deepest layer of what you are, in the molecular instructions that you did not write and cannot read but that define, in ways more fundamental than any cultural inheritance, the physical being that you are. They are in there, still doing their work, 40,000 years later. Chapter 12. The cliff is still there. Go to Gibraltar. Not tonight. Not in any literal sense. But follow the thought there. Because it is worth ending in a specific place rather than in the abstraction where stories about deep prehistory tend to dissolve. The Rock of Gibraltar is still there. It has not gone anywhere. The limestone that was laid down in shallow tropical seas 300 million years ago, compressed and folded and uplifted by the collision of the African and European tectonic plates, sits at the southern tip of Europe exactly where it has always sat. Watching, indifferent, patient, in the way that only geology can be patient. The caves are still there. Gorham's Cave is accessible from the narrow beach at the base of the eastern cliff, though access is now managed and restricted to protect the extraordinary archaeological record the cave system contains. The chambers that Neanderthal individuals sheltered in, the floors that hold the layered record of their fires, and their meals, and their tool manufacture, and the feathers they collected, and the lines they cut into the stone. Those floors are still there, still accumulating their slow geological time, still holding in their sediments the evidence of a presence that ended 40,000 years ago. The Mediterranean is still there. On a clear morning, the water below the eastern cliffs of Gibraltar catches the light in the particular way that the Mediterranean catches light, warmer in color than northern seas, more reflective, as if the water itself were participating in the illumination rather than simply receiving it. The Neanderthals, who sheltered in the caves above that sea, watched this same light on this same water. Not this specific morning, not these specific conditions, but this sea, in this place, with this quality of light. Africa is still visible across the strait on a clear day. 14 kilometers of water, the mountains of Morocco rising from the southern shore. The same narrow gap between two worlds. The same sense of being at an edge. A place where one thing ends and another begins. The last communities of Neanderthals could see what we can see. They did not cross to Africa. Whatever the reasons, they appear to have stayed where they were. In the caves they knew. In the landscape they had learned across generations, until some of their last traces appear to end here. On this cliff. Above this sea. Consider for a moment what it means that we can stand in the same place they stood. Not many of the sites that figure in stories of deep prehistory retain that quality. The cities of vanished civilizations are rubble or reconstruction. Drowned landscapes lie beneath the sea. The connection to the past that those places offer is real but mediated, filtered through centuries of change and the physical transformations that time imposes on everything human beings build. Gibraltar is different. The cliff is the cliff. The cave is the cave. The sea is the sea. The view from the eastern face of the rock, looking out over the Mediterranean toward Africa, is not a reconstruction or an approximation. It is the same view, held in the same limestone, lit by the same sun, above the same water. When you stand there, or when you imagine standing there, you are standing where they stood. Not in a metaphorical sense. In the sense that the specific piece of rock beneath your feet was beneath their feet, that the air moving off the Mediterranean was moving off the Mediterranean for them, that the sound of the waves at the base of the cliff was the sound they fell asleep to. In the caves above, in the time before they were gone. That continuity is not nothing. Inside Gorham's Cave, in the sediments that researchers have spent years carefully excavating and analyzing, the record of the last communities of Neanderthals is preserved in the only form in which it survives. charcoal from their fires, bones from their meals, stone flakes from their tool manufacture, the cut-marked bones of eagles whose feathers they collected, the geometric lines cut into the bedrock floor. These are not grand artifacts. They are the quiet debris of daily life, the residue of ordinary existence in an extraordinary time and place. But that is precisely what makes them moving. If you allow yourself to consider what they actually are, each piece of charcoal in those sediments is the remains of a fire that a specific individual built and tended. Someone gathered the fuel. Someone carried the warmth from a previous fire to light a new one. Someone sat beside that fire in the dark of the cave and was warm because of it. That someone is gone beyond any possibility of recovery. But the charcoal remains. The fire happened. The warmth was real. Each animal bone in those deposits is the remains of a meal that was shared. Someone hunted or caught or collected the animal. Someone processed the carcass. Someone ate. In the eating, there was the brief, ordinary satisfaction of hunger met, of a body sustained for another day, of a life continuing that would, in the end, not continue indefinitely. The feathers that are no longer present in the deposits but whose prior presence is recorded in the cut marks on the wing bones of eagles, those feathers were worn by someone. Someone chose them for their appearance. Someone wanted to be seen wearing them. Someone moved through the world of the southern Mediterranean coast wearing the feathers of eagles, and was seen in that way by the other people in their group. And whatever meaning that carried in their world was a real meaning, experienced by real people, in the real light of a specific afternoon that happened 40,000 years ago and will not happen again. All of that is gone now. And yet the cave holds the record of it. Imperfect, fragmentary, requiring years of patient work to read even partially. But there, the past does not disappear entirely. It leaves traces. The traces are smaller than the reality they record. They are harder to read than the reality was to live. But they are there, in the sediments of caves and the sequences of degraded DNA and the cut marks on ancient bone, waiting for the questions that will allow them to speak. The researchers who work at Gorham's Cave are still working there. Each season of excavation adds to the record. Each new analysis of existing samples adds to the understanding. The picture of the last Neanderthal communities is more detailed now than it was 20 years ago. And it will be more detailed 20 years from now than it is today. The cave is patient. The sediments are patient. The record held in the limestone is patient in the way that only geology can be patient, across timescales that make human urgency seem very small. The Neanderthals, who sheltered in that cave, could not have imagined the world that would come after them. They could not have imagined the species that would eventually dig through the floors of their home and read the evidence of their lives in the charcoal and the bones and the cut marks they left behind. They could not have imagined that something of themselves would persist in the bodies of the people who came after, carried forward in molecular form across 40,000 years of human history, still doing its work in the immune systems of people on every continent. They lived in the world they had. They lived in it fully, and they left what they left, and then they were gone. The cliff is still there. The cave is still there. The sea is still there. And in the quiet before sleep, if you let yourself go there, to that specific cliff, above that specific sea, on that specific edge of Europe, you can stand in the same light they stood in. You can look south at Africa across the same 14 kilometers of water. You can feel, if you choose to feel it, the weight of 40,000 years of absence pressing gently against the present moment. They were here. For nearly 400,000 years, they were here, and then they were not. And the world continued, as it always continues, carrying forward what it could of what they were. In the sediments of caves and the sequences of genomes and the particular quality of light on the Mediterranean, on a clear morning when Africa is visible across the water and the past feels, for a moment, not quite as far away as it actually is. Let that feeling stay with you as you drift off tonight. Not grief. Not exactly. Something quieter than grief and more durable. The knowledge that something was here before us. That it was full and specific and real. That it left traces. That some of those traces are in you. And that the cliff it stood on is still standing. Patient and present. At the edge of the continent, where some of their last traces appear to end, the past is patient. It has been waiting 40,000 years. It can wait a little longer. Sleep well. Good night.